Hello, my name is Armando and I'm a naturalist here at Beaver Lake Nature Center. In this 4-part video series, Nature at Home, we are going to discuss how to create a natural space in and outside of your home. This week, we are on part 2, where we are going to talk about in-the-ground gardening. First, we'll talk about the couple different types of in-the-ground gardening, and then we'll talk about how to set them up. So let's jump right in. First, I want to touch a little bit on flower beds. Most of us are pretty familiar with flower beds. They are a visually pleasing garden. Gardeners will use the colors and the textures of the plants and plant them in a way that sort of ups the curb appeal of our homes, buildings, and walkways. These plants generally are ornamental plants grown for the different beautiful characteristics that they have. But nothing says you can't use edible plants as well. Speaking of edible plants, let's talk about farm-style gardening. Farm-style gardening is basically taking an agricultural production and scaling it down to fit your land. We usually plant these in rows and make it easier to go in and out to either maintain the plants by clipping or pruning and then eventually harvesting. These are usually edible plants that we grow, vegetables and fruits, and we'll usually section off the area and protect it with a border. The border is used usually to help deter pests. Now I want to talk a little bit about a specific type of gardening using a method called companion planting. And we learned this from the Native Americans with the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters are the 3 main crops that the Native Americans had, which were corns, beans, and squash. So with companion planting, you're using the characteristics of a plant to benefit other plants. And these plants will grow basically together and produce a much more bountiful harvest. So the corn grows very tall and rigid and provides a lot of structure. The beans will use the corn to grow since beans are a climbing plant and need to climb. Beans are nitrogen fixing, so they're going to add more nitrogen into the system, making a more rich nutrient soil for the plants. Then you get the squash, which are a ground cover plant. The leaves and the vines are covered in little tiny hairs that predators and pests don't like to touch, so it keeps the plants safe. The big leaves also provide a good ground cover to prevent weeds from growing because it shades them out, and it also helps prevent moisture loss. So planting together like this is very beneficial to create a more bountiful harvest. Just note that some plants do require multiple plants in order to cross-pollinate properly. So something like corn, you're going to need to grow quite a few rows of them to be able to get a pretty decent harvest. So now I want to touch on community plots. This is sort of a type of garden for those of us who might live in Syracuse City. Basically, these are areas of land that are sectioned off for people who don't have places to grow their own food or have their own garden but want to. So in a place like Syracuse City, like where I live, I don't really have much real estate in order to grow my own garden. So I would look for a place like this where I can go in, maybe pay yearly dues and be able to grow my own food. A big part of the community gardens is the social aspect. You know, you're growing food with your neighbors. You get to talk to them about their tips and tricks, and you can even trade harvests when you guys are growing food. This particular garden is the Isabella Street Tapestry Garden in the north side of Syracuse. If you're in Syracuse City, definitely head to syracusegrows.org if you are interested in finding a community garden that's near you. If you don't live in the city and sort of live in the outside, this might not have the different gardens for you that you can grow, but they do have a bunch of resources on their website that can tell you how to grow your own garden, how to even start your own community garden, and also has quite a few resources for different states. So syracusegrows.org is a wealth of knowledge for you if you're interested in gardening. So now we talked about a bit of the couple types of gardens you can have. Let's talk about how to set them up. Something you really want to think about are your light levels. Sunlight is super important. It's the way that plants produce their own food. So you want to make sure that wherever you have your plot of land, it's getting adequate sunlight. make sure that, like I said, full sun, but if you have plants that don't require it, I would still recommend going ahead and putting your garden in a full sun area, because then you can always amend for the full sun. Either growing plants that do require a lot of full sun and using that to shade out the rest of the garden, or having a shade cloth to block out some light. But you want to make sure that you do give adequate sun. Next, let's talk about your water source. Depending on where you are, you might want to consider a different method, because depending on where your light source is coming from, where you're getting your water might be too far. In those cases, you might be stuck having to lug your buckets of water to your garden every day to water them properly. For some people, that is sort of out of the question. If you have access to a hose, that will be the best way to water your garden. You can even consider rain catching. So if you have the garden in an area that isn't close enough for a hose, maybe setting up a barrel system where you collect water from the rain, which has a hose attachment to it. You can use that in order to water your gardens. Next, let's talk about the soil. Soil is something you're going to want to invest in. It is the foundation of your plants and where they get a lot of their nutrients from. Here in Central New York, we have quite a few different types of soils. So let's discuss those. First, we have clay. Clay is slippery to the touch when wet, and when dry is really compact and really, really hard. They do hold a lot of nutrients, but since they get so hard when they're dry, it restricts root growth and prevents plants from growing properly. Next, we have sandy soils. These soils are incredibly airy, really well-draining soils, but they don't hold a lot of nutrients and dry out too fast, so you will have to constantly keep watering, which could get expensive over time. Next, we have silty soils. Silt is a really good baseline. It has a lot of nutrients, and it will have some drainage, but not as much as sandy soils, and it kind of feels a little soapy to the touch. It's soft and feels a little bit soapy. Next, you have peaty soil. Peat soils are spongy and grow really well for any plants that need a lot more moisture. You can find peaty soils all over Central New York. We do have a lot of peatlands, basically bogs, fens, and wetlands. And peat is derived from decomposing sphagnum moss. These are a little bit more on the acidic side, so if you have plants that don't do as well in acidic soils, you might need to amend them. Next, we've got something called chalky, basically full of rocks and different bigger sized sediments. You'll find that we have a lot of rockier soils here as well. Then we have sort of the perfect mixture of soil, loamy soil. This one has the adequate water drainage, adequate moisture retention, and really good nutrient substances inside. Generally, if you're looking for loamy soils, a lot of people like to think about 40% sandy, 40% silty, and about 20% clay. Perfect mixture of moisture retention, nutrients, and water drainage. So now you're trying to figure out what kind of soil do you have. There's a couple of things you can do. Definitely go ahead and dig up some soil and feel it. Does it feel slippery? Does it feel spongy? Does it feel gritty? Those types of textures will sort of point you in the right direction. You can also do something called the ribbon test, where you take the damp soil and you kind of rub it between your hands, and then you lift up that ribbon. If it falls apart automatically, you probably have sandier soils. If it just stays together and is a really strong clump, you probably have more clay. Then obviously if you see big rocks, you might have chalkier soils, or if it's feeling a little spongy, and you probably have a peatier soil. But to be really definitive of what kind of soil you have, you can always get your soil tested. So Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences is basically a great resource for you to have if you're not familiar with what kind of soil you have. You send in a sample, and they will go ahead and test it and let you know what the results are. there you can amend the soil that you have appropriately. Next, let's talk about tools of the trade. So when you're first starting out, I would recommend you start out small. Start with a smaller plot of land, smaller garden, and kind of work your way up. You can always add more. So generally you'll need something to dig with, so a nice trowel or shovel, something to break up the soil, so rake or a little claw. Eventually you'll need something to prune or cut your plants to harvest. Gardening gloves just for protection and to keep your hands clean, and something to water with. Those are the basic tools that you will have. As your garden grows and you're doing something a little bit more fancy, if you will need bigger and better tools, but these are the good basics to have. Now, let's talk about a couple of plants that you might be interested in growing. These plants are mostly native. There's one that has been introduced, but not invasive. These are good for our area, and they are quite winter hardy. Something that's really important to know is the hardiness zones that we live in. So here in Syracuse, New York, we're basically of zone 5B. The soil gets down to about -15 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, so it's really, really cold. There are certain plants that can't grow in that area or that can't withstand that in the winter, and so you're going to need to plant those every year. Plants that you plant every year are called annuals, and the plants that will come back every year are called perennials. And these ones in particular that I will show you, I'll show you 2 ornamentals and 2 edibles. These are perennial plants. So first let's talk about white trillium. These are beautiful early spring flowering plants. So if you have a garden and we're just getting out of winter, these are going to be some of the few plants that you will see first. They grow through rhizomes, think like a potato. So they will root, they will grow these rhizomes, and in these rhizomes another plant will come out. And so they will eventually spread, and so you'll have a nice lush bushy area of trillium. Just note though, since they are early spring plants, animals that are coming out of winter that are looking for something green and fleshy are going to eat these plants. So looking at you, deer, the deer will eat these plants as soon as they see them, because all throughout winter they're trying to find good substantial food, and when these start popping up, that's when they're going to go crazy for these plants. So just a heads up. Next we have bee balm. These are native, and pollinators love bee balm. As you can see, there is a bee in this picture. They are in the mint family, so they will grow pretty rapidly and pretty voraciously, so you will need to maintain these and weed them out. These like full sun. They will grow better as more sun you can give them, and a nice even moisture to their soil. They grow about 2 to 4 feet, so they do get pretty tall. Next is our first introduced species. This is asparagus. It is a vegetable that we all know and that we all see in the supermarket. These are incredibly cold tolerant plants, and they do better when there are longer periods of cold climates. Just letting you know, for these plants, they do sort of require some patience. You can harvest them the first year, but if you want to fully establish these plants so you can keep harvesting for years to come, you're going to want to wait. So the first year, let them grow, and then the second year, you can harvest a couple of them, but you're going to want to let them mostly grow as well. Now when the third year comes, that's when their root systems are fully developed and fully established, and then you can go ahead and start harvesting them. You are still going to want to make sure that there are some plants that you're letting grow to full maturity so they can get more nutrients, produce more food, so they can keep growing every single year. We usually collect the tender growth, which is about 6 to 8 inches of fresh green growth that you can just snap right off, or you can cut them off. Once you let them grow fully, you're not going to want to eat those. They get really, really woody, and they kind of have a little bit of a fern-like appearance when they grow to full maturity. If you let these fully establish, you'll be able to basically harvest them for decades to come. So Be a little bit patient right from the get-go, and they will grow back every year for you. Finally, I have blackberries for you. Blackberries are pretty common here in central New York, and you can find them growing pretty much anywhere. They can grow well in full sun, and they can withstand some shady areas as well. They might not be able to produce as much fruit for you if you let them grow in shadier spots, but they will still grow, and it might just take them a little bit longer to produce fruit. But this is an edible blackberry. You can eat these, but just note that you will have some animals that will eat them as well. So you're gonna wanna basically fight for these berries, because the birds and some woodland creatures will definitely go out for the berries as well. So that's it for this week, where we talked about in-the-ground gardening and how to set them up. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And then next week, we are going to talk about above-ground gardening and how to set those up and what to look for. All right? So until next week, have a good week. Bye.